So there's basically 4 classifications of flotation tires. You have an HF1, which it's a high flotation, but it has a shallow tread. And some of these tires are made in smaller sizes, like 15-inch, 17-inch, 20-inch, things like that. Because they got shallow tread, you see them used in golf course work and stuff like that, where they're fertilizer spreading on golf courses, some cutting, things like that, where you don't want to create ruts. The HF2 is a high flotation. It's a regular low tread for general farming, and most of these have a tractor type tread design, even though some of the bigger ones are starting to have like lug type tread design on them, which we'll look at some different designs. But an HF2, they're somewhere between 19 and 30 seconds, depending on the size. The HF3 is a high flotation, and it's a deeper lug. The lugs get deeper. It's made for wetter, moist soil. And they're generally from like 36 to 30 seconds, depending on the size. So you can see the tread's getting a little bit deeper. And an HF4 is a high flotation, extra deep tread, and that's for really wet dirt. It's almost like for rice and cane, like a R2 type tread. On flotation tires, they're made in they're made 2 ways. We still make a lot of bias, and there's still a lot of bias used, bias supply tires. And radials have really come on the scene, so a lot of people are running radials. Some of the radials are made with steel belts or aramid, and some of them aren't. Some of them are just with a radial design. And when they say a radial design, that doesn't necessarily mean they have steel belts in them. But if you'll notice the picture on the left, the cords run from bead to bead across the tire. Whereas on a bias ply tire, if you'll notice, the cords are crisscrossed going through. And so the benefit of a radial, just by looking at the construction on this, the benefit of a radial is they run a lot cooler. When you're running, when you're running down the highway and things like that, they run a lot cooler because you don't have the cords moving around in there and creating heat. And heat is a big killer of tires. If you overheat them, get them too hot, and they start coming apart and inside decomposing, they don't heal themselves. They just keep getting worse. And so that's the reason that radials have become kind of popular. We still sell a lot of bias if you don't have to make long runs and you're pretty close to the field and things like that. Bias still work well. One of the differences also between bias and radial is radial tires, you can run lower air pressures in them, and so you reduce your compaction, your soil compaction. But on bias, you can't reduce air pressures. You have to run them at higher air pressures. If you run them at lower air pressures, then you destroy the casing on the tire. On flotation tires, there's basically 3 types out there. This is kind of a real basic thing, but how to read the sizes on them. Like an 800 45 R26.5. The 800, just basically, that's the width of the tire in millimeters. It's from sidewall to sidewall when it's inflated. And there's 25.4 millimeters in an inch. So if you divide 800 by 25.4, if you work in inches, that'll give you the width in inches. The 45 is the aspect ratio. That's the percentage of the sidewall to the width. That means that the sidewall is 45% of the width. And so the higher that number gets, the taller the tire gets. The lower that number gets, the shorter the tire gets, because you're lengthening the sidewall. You're making it bigger or smaller. If you see an R in there, the R always stands for radial. So you know it's a radial. And the 26.5 is the only measurement in inches, and that's the rim size in inches. You'll also see something like this, a 560-22.5. Again, the 500 is the width of the tire in millimeters. The 60 is the aspect ratio, the percentage of the sidewall to the width. But where you see the dash, when you see a dash, it's bias. And sometimes you'll see a D in there. They'll have a 560D22.5 or a 560-22.5. If you see a dash or a D, it's always a bias. And the 22.5 again is the wheel size in inches. So on some of the older sizes, like a 48 3120, if you see this, the 48 is the approximate height of the tire in inches. And I'm saying approximate because it should be 48 inches, but different manufacturers kind of build them at different ones. And I think ours is about 50 inches tall. The 31 is the approximate width of the tire in inches, about 31 inches wide from sidewall to sidewall, and it's on a 20-inch rim. So that's the that's most of the sizes that you'll see out there in those. They're not like tractor tires where you have 18.4-38s and 20.8-38s and things like that. You can pretty much get the size of them. Also, one of the things that you'll see on flotation tires on the sidewall of it is they have the load index and the speed rating. There's a chart, and you can go on the internet and get it, or most everybody's data book has a table in it. But like on some of them, you'll see 148B, and so that basically means that tire will carry 6,945 pounds. If you look on the chart at 148, it's 6,945, and it'll carry it at 30 miles per hour, which is the B. It's their speed rating, and that's at max air pressure. If you see a 178D, again, it basically means the same thing. That tire will carry 16,535 pounds, and it'll carry at 40, and the D stands for 40, and you'll see E, which is 45, J is 62, you'll see A8/B, you'll see B, things like that. But those charts are in data books, or you can go on the internet and get them off. You'll also see a 152D/a 163A8. You'll see things like that. So with tires, with all tires, car tires, light truck tires, farm tires, doesn't matter. The faster the speed that you go, the less weight carrying capacity it has. The slower the speed you go, the more it picks up weight carrying capacity, the more you have. So if you see one like this, the 151D, that means that tire will carry 7,825 pounds at 40 miles an hour, but it'll carry 10,745 pounds at 25 miles an hour. So when you and both are at max air pressure, and when you slow a tire down, you have more weight carrying capacity. Also, you'll see this. This is a load chart for bias ply tires. On some of them, you'll see if you'll notice on the left, it has your miles per hour, and it has FR and DW. The FR stands for free rolling. So if you have that tire on a trailer, on a manure spreader pulled by a tractor, things like that, in a free rolling application, the tires carry more weight free rolling than they do as a drive wheel, which is what the DW stands for. If you have the tires are actually on a drive wheel and they actually have the torque of pulling the equipment, they're part of the drivetrain part of it, then they're rated to carry a little bit less weight. If you'll notice across the top, you have PSIs, 38, 41, and 44. Remember, I said a few minutes ago, you can only run bias ply tires at a certain low air pressure. They're not made to run at real low air pressures. And of course, the slower you run and the higher air pressure you have, the more weight carrying capacity you have. Air in a tire is what carries the weight. So if you need a lot of weight carrying capacity, you want to run it at max air, right at max air pressure. And the more you can slow it down, the more weight gain you get, the more weight carrying capacity you get. On radials, this is a radial load chart. If you'll notice, the DW and the FR is not in there. So the construction of radials allows for them to be used in drive wheels or free rolling applications without a loss of load carrying capacity. But again, if you're reading these, if you'll notice on the left, it gives you your speeds in the green from 5 to 45 miles an hour. Across the top is the air pressures from 12 psi up to 58 psi. And again, the slower you run and the more air pressure you have, the more weight carrying capacity you have. So when you get, so just for instance, just say you have a tire, if at 5 miles an hour in field, or between 5 and 15 in the field, if you'll notice on the far right, you have 23,350 to 26,590 load carrying capacity at 58 psi. But as you gain speed, if you'll notice, I mean, your load carrying capacity almost drops in half from 26,590 at 5 miles an hour down to 13,450 at 45 miles an hour. So, and I'm bringing this out because, it's kind of important to know how to read the load and inflation tables and to know how much air you need in tires, so that you don't get into problems with them and tear them up. because one of the problems with flotation tires that we see is that they're roaded a lot. They're on the highway a lot. And so they're run at higher speeds a lot. And, you know, I don't know, some of these are, you know, they're run 60 or 70% on the highway and 20 to 30% in the field. So air pressures are very important on keeping these things together and making sure when you buy some that you get your money's worth out of them, that they don't come apart and get destroyed before you get your use out of them. So there's a lot of different sizes of flotation tires out now. A couple of the most common is 550 45 22.5s and the 560 45 22.5s. These two, they have close to the same diameter as the Low Pro 22.5 truck tire and 11R 22.5, so they're kind of easy retrofit for trucks. We see a lot of these sizes being used when putting on trucks. One thing I'll say about trucks, generally if they're on manure spreaders that are pulled by tractors, I know the Fence and some of the JCBs, they run about 45 miles an hour. So 45 is about the max they run. But when these are put on Max and Kenworths and Internationals and things like that, I mean, those trucks will run 70 or 80 miles an hour. But these tires are not designed to run that fast, especially for 20 miles or 30 miles or whatever down the road. So you have to be careful to slow them down and stay within the recommended mileage range and the load range of the tires to make sure that you get your use out of them. Because we see a lot of people, they'll put them on trucks and then they want to run 65 or 70 down the highway, and they just won't hold together when you're doing that. Again, there's a lot of different flotation tires out there. Some are made for the field, some are made for both, with emphasis more on the highway. Here's a couple, a few that we make. We make the FL639, and you can see on the left, you can see that tread design. It's 75-25 field, 75% field use, 25% road use. The FL630 Plus is a 50-50 field and road. It's made, and if you look at the FL693M, which has a lot more lugs on it, has a lot more land and a lot less seat, it's 25-75 road oriented. So that tire's made to run on the highway more than the one on than the FL639 on the far left. You can see the difference in the tread designs on them. This is one, we were talking about speed ratings just a little bit ago. Here's one that we make. It's the 650R 22.5 Performa, but it actually is rated at a J speed rating. The J speed rating is 62 miles an hour. So it's an all steel radial. It's got high load carrying capacity. And if you'll notice on this one, you can drop air pressures in these. I just put this load chart up there, but it's 62 miles an hour. If you run 94 PSI in it, it'll carry 11,000 pounds. That's quite a bit of weight carrying capacity for a flotation tire at 62 miles an hour. So, as we were talking about earlier, standard truck tires and retreads are sometimes used in this application. You still see a lot of them used in that on trucks and trailers, especially if they have to travel great distances between farm and fields at highway speeds. And some of these, you know, I mean, a lot of times like in dairies and things like that, I mean, they don't travel too terribly far, maybe 10, 20 miles out. But we've run in where people were running 60 miles out on these things to spread. And 60 miles is a long ways on the highway because the tires are big, they're leggy, and they build up a lot of heat. But these tires, they have to be, and the truck tires have to be run at high pressures that increase soil compaction, and they reduce your traction in the field. With truck tires, sometimes you basically have very little traction in the field, where with flotation tires, you really have a lot of traction. So the high-speed flotation tires are rated at speeds of 40 to 62 miles an hour. Like I said, back some of the older ones were only at 25, so there's been a lot of technology in these. A lot of technology have come into these. Manufacturers have done a good job with getting flotation tires up where they'll run good, and you can use them on the road and in the field. Like I say, some of the equipment's pulled by tractors that will run 40 to 45 miles an hour. JCBs and Fence are an example of fast tractors, high-speed tractors. And on some of them, some beds are added to medium and heavy duty trucks, as you see the picture on the left. And this, when we were talking about speeds and stuff, this is sometimes the problems you get into with the speeds is the tires won't handle the speeds that those heavy duty trucks will run sometimes. So they either have to be governed down or you have to lighten up on the foot a little bit. So the flotation tire category, it covers a broad spectrum of applications and equipment. I mean, they can be used for a lot of different things. But in the best tire for the job, they're different for each application. You know, I mean, there's times that you need something bigger, wider, and there's times you don't need something so big. But it covers everything from golf course work up to hay, to silage, to manure spreading, fertilizer spreading. I mean, there's a ton of applications for these. So flotation tires, they can combine speed with good field performance. Because of the high-speed road travel, flotation tires can't be heavily overloaded. You have to be very careful when you're running at high speeds with them. But like the manure spreader on the left, you know, when those manure spreaders first started coming out, they were basically single axles, and they started getting bigger, and they started adding more weight to them, and then they went to 2 axles to be able to carry the weight and handle the weight of them, and then they went to 3 axles, and now some of them are 4 axles. So these things are super heavy. They're super heavy, and they run, you know, and if you're having to road them quite a bit, they're you got a lot of time spent on the highway with them. If you're on the highway a lot, radials are best for highway use and heavy load applications, because generally they're rated to carry a lot more weight than bias are, and they run a lot cooler than bias do, as we talked. And heat is kind of a killer of tires, so you want them to run as cool as you possibly can. But even with radials, the load and speed ratings have to be honored to minimize the possibility of tire failures. We see a lot of these out running, check on a lot of them and things like that, and by and large, they most all run pretty well, and they even run well in bad applications, in some totally severe applications, but they're not bulletproof. They really, the load and speed ratings are very important to maintain and stay within on these. So flotation tires, they can roll over wet and loose soil to minimize soil compaction. That's the purpose of them. They can limit rutting in the fields. They can be used in free rolling or driveway applications, and they can carry a lot of weight. But again, as we said, you have to watch the speed on them. So with truck tires run at basically, according to what air pressures you run in them, at 80 to 110 PSI, depending on the load. They can run at highway speeds, but they provide poor traction in the fields. When you get out in the field with them, you basically have very little traction. Whereas the flotation tires are wider, they're leggy, so they give you that traction in the field that you need to get through. So let's talk about air pressures and stuff for just a minute, because this is kind of the purpose of flotation tires, is to minimize soil compaction and minimize damage to your dirt. But radial tires, they basically exert a pressure of 1 to 2 pounds higher than their inflation pressure. So if you have a radial flotation tire inflated to 58 PSI, then that tire is basically exerting about 60 pounds per square inch of ground bearing pressure on the soil. If you have a truck tire inflated to 100 PSI, then it exerts a pressure of about 102 PSI on the ground. And it doesn't cover as big an area of ground. So you have a smaller width tire with that much weight on the ground, and so you have especially in wet dirt, then you have a chance of it rutting more. And there's some effects from compaction whenever you do that, and we'll talk about that. So what happens when the soil is compacted? If you'll notice in this field, you can see the water and the ruts. Well, when soil's compacted, then it doesn't let the water get off of it. It doesn't help evacuate the water. The water just sits there on top. Whereas you can see in some of the rows, there's no water, but there is in the tracks. So what is soil compaction? So soil compaction is an increase in bulk density, and it's a decrease in pore space of the soil. You want your soil to have so much pore space for air and water and nutrients and things like that, and mixed in with the dirt. And so soil compaction is caused by applying pressure to the soil, and a lot of times it's caused by tractors, trucks, combines, grain carts, manure spreaders, things like that. And soil compaction can cause a physical barrier to normal healthy root growth. And if you'll notice in the picture, the second layer there, it says roots cannot penetrate. So what happens is when you plant your seed, the roots grow down to the hard pan to a point where they can't go in anymore. And so then they start spreading out. And if that hard pan is, I don't know, 12, 14 inches deep, then you don't have a healthy root block in there. So a good winds come by, things like that, it just blows them over. And you don't get, and because they can't go down and get moisture, and they can't get the nutrients out of the ground, you don't get the crops that you'd normally get. Here's kind of an example. If you'll notice the one I have circled in red, that's from compacted soil. If you'll notice the root blocks with the other corn, how they kind of come down and spread out, and that one goes out left and right. There's no downward roots to it. So the effects of soil compaction, they reduce the water infiltration, the water holding capacity, and air exchange. In years when moisture is in short supply or excessive, the pore space in the soil acts as a reservoir, and it also acts as a conduit system to get the water out. So you don't have water sitting on top of the ground. That helps get rid of it. And it buffers the effects of moisture streams. You can have in years when there's not a lot of rain, if the roots can grow down, they can grow down and get some of the moisture deeper in the ground. So ideal soil is composed of about 50% pore space allocated equally to water and air. It allows roots to displace soil as they grow. Heavy wheel traffic, especially under wet conditions, as you can see on the picture on the left, it damages the soil structure. And because what it does is it presses it down, it compacts that soil structure, and so you don't have the pore allocation in there. Instead of water filtering through it, it just sits on top of the ground. Wet soils are a lot more susceptible to compaction than dry soil is. Just because it's so wet, it pushes down and pushes the pore space together. So here's kind of a look at soil compaction. If you look on the left, the air and water, if you'll notice there's plenty of space in there for the air, and there's plenty of space for the water. On the one on the right is where it's compacted, so you've basically taken away all your air space. There's a lot of water in there, but there's very little air, and you need both. You need both of them for the plants to grow well. And if no-till's being done, air also helps with decomposition. It helps with decomposition of the old crops. So on soil compaction, the roots, they encounter, as we talked about before, they encounter a physical barrier to growth because there's nowhere for them to move the soil. If you'll notice on the left, the plant on the left has run into compacted soil. The one on the right allows its root growth to go down. The compacted soil, it restricts water, air, and nutrients, and adjustments to minimize soil pressure also minimizes compaction. And so as we were talking about air pressures, and this is on tractor tires as well as it is on flotation tires, but the less air that you can run in a radial, the less ground bearing pressure you have, so the less soil compaction you have. And that's one of the reasons why people have went away from regular truck tires that you have to run 100 PSI in to a flotation tire that you can run 45 to 58 or 60 PSI in. There is some flotation tires, some of the higher ones, you can run higher air pressures in them, and you need to run the correct air pressures to carry the weight. And if that's 75 instead of 58, then that's what it is. But you don't want to overload the tires either. You want them to have, excuse me, you want them to have enough weight carrying capacity to carry the equipment that's being pulled with it. So Effects on air pressures. So if you don't have the right air pressure and the correct amount, the tire can fail. Kind of what oil is to an engine, air is to a tire. You've got to have the air pressure, and the air pressure is kind of what carries the weight. So it has to be in there in the correct amount. If you have too much air in there, too much air in a tire, more than you need for the load, it decreases the flexing of the casing, and it results in a smaller footprint because the tire tends to want to ride in the middle of the tire, and your outside edges are not touching. It gives you a rougher ride, and it can give you impact breaks. If you run over something, a brick, a concrete block, or something like that, and you run over it fast, then it can lead to impact breaks inside the tire. But too little tire, it stresses the casing, and so when the tire's going down the road, it's going up and down, and it's kind of the same effect as taking a clothes hanger and the metal part and bending it back and forth until it breaks. That's what happens to the sidewall of the tire if it stresses too much, but it leads to rapid wear, and it'll eventually lead to tire failure. So that's why air pressure is so important in these. But either extreme, it hurts performance and it can ruin a tire. And these tires are not cheap. They're very expensive. So I know when you buy them, you want to get your money's worth out of them. So as we were talking about heavily overloading the tire, it can cause a myriad of problems. The load carrying capacities and speeds are very important to follow and protect tires. Heat buildup will destroy tires as it causes the tire casings and cords to unravel. Heat buildup is the biggest killer of tires, and they can be susceptible to irregular road wear. In saying that about them, though, flotation tires, they make a huge difference in the field. You get a lot more traction, a lot more flotation, but they have to be taken care of to ensure that you get the service and life expected. Underinflating and overloading are killers, and speed can damage. Too much speed can damage flotation tires. Speed and inflation are very important with these, and I'm kind of hammering on that because we sell a lot of these. We see a lot of these in the market, and when some fail, we go and look at them, and generally it's always too much speed, not running enough air pressure, or way overloading them. And here's an example. I just kind of threw this in here, but what can happen to a tire when it's put in the wrong application? So this tire, a couple weeks ago, went out and looked at it. It's a 710/40R22.5 FL639. And if you'll notice, there's the load and speed ratings. But this tire at 40 miles an hour, you'll notice at 40 miles an hour at 58 PSI has a 10,200 pound load carrying capacity on it. So they were running them on this trailer, and the trailer axle weight's rated at 60,000 pounds. They were running at 55 to 60,000 pounds on it, but you only have 40,800 pounds of load carrying capacity with the tires. So the tires are overloaded at this point, and especially if you're running at 40 to 45 miles an hour with it, which when you have a driver in a truck, they're going to run as fast as they can possibly run because you're trying to get time's of the essence a lot of times, so you need to get there and get back. And so here's what happens to these whenever you overload them and run at high speeds. They start looking like this. They start opening up in the tread area, and they graduate to that where the cords start breaking and the cords start coming out, and then they graduate to that where they come apart across the tire, and it looks like that. So this is why I've just stressed so much on this thing about air pressure, speed, and heat, is because even though these tires do a very good job and they're very good tires out in the field, if you don't take care of them, you can also have problems. But you can have problems with truck tires also, right? If you overload truck tires or too much speed and you start getting the funky wear, sidewalls, if you don't run enough air pressure in them, then sidewalls start coming apart in them, even in 11R22.5s or 11R24.5s. So with that said, here's some flotation tires that we make. that seem to be pretty popular, and I think even in Canada, quite a few of these are sold up in Canada. But one is the Flotation 648. This is actually a bias ply tire, and like I said, we still sell a lot of bias along with the radials. And this tire has the hockey stick type tread design on it, which is still a very popular design. That design has been around for years, but a lot of people still use them because it gives you relatively good traction, and it rolls relatively easy on the highway. But we make it 19 sizes up to a 850/50 30.5. We make it in standard, heavy duty and high speed applications. They're all tubeless, and I don't know of anybody that makes these tube type anymore, but tube type tires run a lot hotter than tubeless tires do. With tubeless tires, you have the air and it dissipates the heat a lot better. But this tire is made for field and road transport and spreading. We also make the Flotation 648T. We only make it in one size, but basically the difference in this tire, if you'll look, the center lug is not as long as the other tire. It's shorter, and the lugs are more opened up. There's a bigger space between the lugs on this tire. But we make it in 2-ply ratings. Of course, they're all tubeless, and again, it's for field and road transport, and it's for hay. To get into the radials, we make the FL639, which has that hockey stick type tread design on it. We make it in 3 sizes, up to a 710 40R 22.5. This tire is basically made for 75% field use, 25% highway use, used in spreading operations. It does relatively well on the highway, and it does very well in the field. You get good traction and stuff with it in the field. And the FL693M, if you'll notice, we make that in 19 sizes up to a 30.5. There's multiple load indexes, and that's made in a 40 and a 45 mile/hour speed ratings. We make it in standard heavy duty, and some of these have steel belts in them. And generally, when you put the steel belts in tires, doesn't necessarily make them carry more weight, but what it does, it provides puncture resistance. Doesn't make them bulletproof, but it does provide puncture resistance with nails and things like that you run over. That's run over in the road and sometimes in the field. But this tire is designed for 75% road use. If you'll notice, it's a lot more luggy, has a lot more rubber on it. It's for trailers and tank trucks, and this one is steel belted. This does have steel belts in it. A couple of designs, we make the FL630 Super and the 630 Ultra. The basic difference in these two is the FL630 Super is an HF2. The Ultra is an HF3, which the Ultra has the lugs are a little bit deeper in it. On the Super, we make 12 sizes. Again, multiple load indexes. It has a 40 mile/hour speed rating. We make standard and heavy duty versions. This tire is steel belted also, and it's made for trailers, tankers, and spreaders. As I said, on the Ultra, it's an HF3. It has deeper lugs. We make it in some 500, make it 9 sizes, up to a 26.5. This tire is made for 50/50 field and road, and again, it's used on trailers, tankers, and spreaders. And so, with these tires, the more land that you have versus sea, the more luggy they are. Sometimes they roll better on the highway because you have more rubber on the highway. You have more rubber on the road. Here's a couple of new tires that we've kind of came out with recently that we'll be adding to some of the lines, but we have the FL633 Performa. It's an HF2. We make it in 1 size right now, but it does have a 62 mile/hour speed rating, and this is an all steel. It has an all steel casing, which means that the steel runs from bead to bead in it. There's actually steel. It's not just an overlay on top of the tire, but there's actually steel in the sidewalls. And it's made for high load capacity. And then we make the V-Flexa, which is a VF tire. And if you don't quite understand the VF technology, what that means is that you have a standard tire, and then you have an IF tire, and the IF carries 20% more weight at the same air pressure, as a standard tire, and the VF carries 40% more weight at the same air pressure. So on these VF tires, if you think about that, you can drop air pressures in them to carry the same weight as a standard tire. And we talked about air pressures relating to soil compaction, the ground bearing pressure. So the less air you can run in a tire, the less ground bearing pressure you'll have. Sometimes with these, you need the weight carrying capacity. And if that's what you need, then you have to run the air pressures up. But there's a possibility that you can drop the air pressures. And this tire is also steel belted. So some best practices for flotation tires is check the air pressure often. Ideally is every day, but at least once a week when working. Make sure you use a calibrated pressure gauge, one that gives you a true reading, and always take the pressure in the morning when the tire's cold. You always want to check air pressures when it's cold, because if you do it at the end of the day and say you want to run 58 PSI in there, and at the end of the day it may be 65 or 70 PSI because it's been running all day and it's hot, and if you let air pressure out then, now you have now the tire's underinflated the next morning when you take off. So always check the air pressures when the air pressures are cold. And that is it. Alan?
Thanks, Dave. We do have one question, Dave, but I also wanted to make a comment because you did talk about some tires being steel construction. One of the things you must remember with steel construction, if you go back to the slide that Dave showed where the tire split right across the whole tire and the guy grabbed it with his hand and pulled it open. This is just a safety note, but caution, steel tires bite. And so if you go and do that and there's chunks of steel in there, you're going to hurt yourself. So please be careful when you're looking at different types of tears and tires and that, to make sure that if it's a steel construction tire that you're not going to get bit as you stick your hand in there.
Yeah, good comment.
We have a question, and I hope I can get this all to you in a way that makes sense, but the question is, tire inflation example 100 PSI. If we have a 10-ton truck on example 200 square inches of tread contact area, that would be 20,000 pounds per 200 square inch equals 100 PSI. But a 20-ton truck on the same area would be 200 PSI. Is that correct?
I don't know. That's a question I just have to look at, and I mean, we can get back to them on that. I mean, I just have to look at it and in my head, right? Yeah. I mean, we can look at it and answer them back.
Okay. Yeah, the question will stay on the Q&A. I understand that one. That appears to be the only question right now. Brittany, they can now put their hands up if they have questions, correct?
Yep. So if anyone has a question, they can raise their hand and we can unmute you. Or if you prefer to just do it via the chat or the Q&A, you can ask some questions there as well.
Okay, just a sec. It looks like another one. Okay, so the same gentleman that had that question, Dave, I'm going to add a little bit to it, and then you can, I don't know if that'll make it any better if we're still have to get back to him, but it's basically the same that he said, 100 PSI. If we have a 10-ton truck, 200 square inches of tread contact area, that would be 20,000 pounds per 200 square inches equals 100 PSI. But a 20-ton truck on the same area would be 200 PSI. Or do we try to increase the number and or size of the tire as the load goes up?
Yeah, so I hope I can answer that by saying this. So what happens with truck tires, a low pro 22.5, 11R 22.5, they're the width that they are, and you generally run duals on those, right? And you can't run them in, you can't run them in real low air pressures. You can't run them at 50 or 60 psi. The truck tires generally stand up to that with the weights. So you have to run them at 80 to about 110. I just threw in the 100 as a just kind of, because that's generally about where people run them at. But by taking the duals off and putting on a flotation tire that can carry the weight that you're carrying, and you're spreading out the footprint of the tire. I realize there's duals on there, but a flotation tire will give you a more solid footprint. And so it spreads out the weight of the tire. It gives you a longer footprint, and it gives you a wider footprint. So you have the weight spread out more evenly distributed than you do if you've got two tires dualed up in a narrow track. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but that's why flotation tire is important. The other part of that is it's not just ground bearing pressure by using truck tires, it's also traction. Because I mean, we've seen fields where they actually had to hook a tractor to a truck and trailer and pull it through the field because there was no traction out there, because you get in that dirt, you get in loose dirt, and all the tires on the truck want to do is spin, low pro 22.5s, 11R 22.5s, whatever. Whereas that flotation tire has more tread bite on it, and it has lugs on it that are different, so you get better traction with it. So you get more pull, and you've got the benefit of the flotation to go along with it.
So he added one more comment, and that is, it is important to match tire size to load weight.
Yes, very, very, very important, because you got to have the tire size and the air pressure to carry the weight of the truck / trailer, / manure spreader, whatever you're pulling. Because if you don't want to overload them, and like that example that I showed, those tires were overloaded, and so as they're overloaded and they're going down the road, they build up heat. You get a lot of heat build up with them, and then they start coming apart. They just can't take it. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Dave. I think that now has answered it. Oh, hang on. Yeah, he said, thanks, gentlemen. So I don't see any other in the Q&A or chats. Are you seeing any hands up, Brittany?
I don't see any here. So just a reminder, a last call, I guess, if you have any questions, you can ask it in the Q&A or the chat function, or you could also raise your hand, and there we can unmute you and you can actually speak. If you do have any more detailed questions that you might want to ask, you can go on the BKT Tires in the exhibitor showcase and send any of the members there a connection request, and then they can set up a meeting with you or just chat through that function as well.
Awesome, perfect. So I think outside of that, thanks very much, Dave. Thanks for everybody that joined us.